Welcome to the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. As Aaron pointed out, it was started by Dr. Josh Posner, who's pictured here on the kiosk, that Greg and our staff, Mark in particular, who works for the group, Mark Walsh, have been really working hard on improving our infrastructure, and this is the latest edition, and we're really happy to see it up and proud of it. Josh, working with folks from the Michael Fields Ag Institute, and also people from Dairy Forage Research Center, and people from the Center for Integrated Ag Systems, and a lot of other stakeholders from Extension and other places, all came together to establish this long-term system in 1989. And the system has been in place and run since then, largely by Dr. Sanford here, Greg, and Janet Hedke, who's over here, I see. Janet has been out in these fields for a significant part of her life and really kept this trial running through the years. Sadly, we lost Josh some 8 years ago or so, 7 or 8 years ago, 2012. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over here to Greg in a minute to describe the system, but I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction to where we are. We're standing in the middle of the Empire Prairie. The Empire Prairie was here for 3,000 or 4,000 years, churning out productive grasses and forbs like the one we see over here in our restored prairie, and of course over those 3,000 or 4,000 years accumulating a vast amount of carbon in the soil. A vast amount of carbon in the soil that within about 125 years, maybe even faster than that, we largely depleted. Estimates are about half of that carbon was depleted very quickly after the plow came to these soils. And so a lot of WICST here is about trying to understand how we can do agriculture in ways that starts to build that carbon back. Take it out of the atmosphere, ideally, and store it in the soils. And so a little bit of what we'll talk about is some of the different cropping systems' ability to do that in this setting. Great.
Yeah, so the trial, WICST, is about 60 acres. It stretches to the cornfield on your west and almost to Highway 51 on your east. It's a pretty standard agronomic trial in the sense that we have a couple treatments and they're randomized in the location in the field. They're represented and then they're replicated 4 times. So we actually have systems here instead of treatments in the sense of with nitrogen, without nitrogen, or with tillage, or less tillage. Josh and colleagues, when they established it, wanted to ask more of the question of whether or not organic agriculture at the time could feed the world. 30 years ago, that was a big debate. And so when they laid it out as systems that were reflective or representative of what we would see here in the north central U.S. or the Great Lakes region. And so we have 3 cash grain rotations. The idea being that those systems are grown to sell the grain, there's no livestock in them. And then we have 3 dairy forage rotations. The idea is that the systems are producing feed for livestock. And then we actually have 3 native systems, and you can see behind me to the left are native grasslands that Randy was just talking about, and behind me to the right is actually some organic soybean fields. So those systems, are arrayed along a gradient. Because they're systems and it's difficult to answer questions when everything's different in systems, we have kind of management gradient. So just looking here at the systems, when we go from the left to the right, the systems become more diverse, and when we go from the top to the bottom, the systems become more perennial. So we have these 2 major axes of diversity and perenniality, which include things like continuous corn, which is shockingly still ubiquitous in the acreage around here. There's a lot of fields that have been in corn, for the past decade. We have a no-till corn-soybean rotation, also a common Midwestern rotation. And then we have kind of a traditional or classic organic rotation, which is corn, followed by soybeans, and then a fall-seeded winter wheat. And that winter wheat is then followed by a cover crop. And for the first 15 years, that cover crop was an interseeded red clover, frost-seeded into the wheat. And for the last 15 or so, it's been an annual planting of berseem, clover, and oats following the wheat. Then we have our forage systems. At the time, we had what was called green gold, a year of corn, followed by 3 years of high production alfalfa. Then we have an organic rotation, which is corn with a oats alfalfa interseeding to get that alfalfa established, and then a year of alfalfa. Both of these receive liquid dairy manure from the Blaine dairy, which is right across the road. And then we have a cool season grass pasture, which at the time was pretty innovative for the area. This is set up to represent a custom heifer raising operation, and we have 4 cool season grass pastures. We have 6 dairy heifers that come out to WICST every year, and they rotate through those pastures, and we follow things like average daily gain, pasture productivity, carbon, etc. And then we have the 3 perennial systems, a monoculture switchgrass, which would be typical of maybe a bioenergy system, or it could be a hay production system, and then a low diversity prairie, which might be similar to CRP and high diversity. So they're all out here in various different arrangements, and we're going to present some of those data to you, kind of discuss some of the findings we've had, particularly with respect to carbon.
I think you're presenting this.
Oh, right. We're co-presenting. So I guess we want to start just with some data in talking about the systems. This is a project that Randy and I worked with Valentin Picasso, who's back there, and Eric Booth on, taking a look at the output of these systems. It's really typical for agronomists to talk about yield, and yield is really easy when you're comparing corn to corn, or when you're comparing soybeans to soybeans. It's a lot more difficult when you're comparing systems to systems. And so what we did with all of our rotations is we fed them into a dairy and figured out how much energy in milk we could get out of them. And so each of the
we fed them into a dairy formula.
A dairy formula,
not
right?
An actual dairy.
Right.
And we didn't do the bottom 3 over there, the native grasses.
We don't have the native grasses. These are the 6 core systems, the agronomic systems. But what's great about this approach is that we can then compare corn to corn soybeans to corn soybean wheat from an energy output standpoint, because they've all been kind of brought on this, standardized on the same metric. So we've got output in gigacalories per hectare, and I just wanted to show you, as we start looking at these things, those systems I just talked about. We've got our corn, our no-till corn soybean, our organic corn soybean wheat, our conventional forage system with alfalfa, our organic forage system with alfalfa and corn, and then our rotationally grazed pasture. And I actually meant to say this as we were starting, but I just want to point out, and Aaron mentioned this, the organic systems here are managed 110% according to USDA organic standards. And the organic management of the systems actually began with the first crops in the ground in 1990. At the time, there was no national organic standard, and so Josh and colleagues worked with local organic farmers to determine, management principles and practices. But with that in mind, these can't be certified because the buffers between plots are only 8 feet, and that's simply for logistical purposes. But all things considered, we have organic trials here that have been in place for 32 years, which is, I think, some of the longest in the state of Wisconsin.
So you don't have to stare too hard at these to see that in general, all the systems are increasing in terms of yield, some of them more significantly than others. And in particular, the high input conventional systems, like the continuous corn or the corn-soybean rotation, and even the corn-alfalfa rotation, which are all managed in, like I say, sort of typical conventional ways, are increasing at higher rates than the other systems. The other systems, the organic systems, not increasing at the same high rate. Not particularly surprising, given the intense input on breeding and selection that's gone into these conventional varieties, as opposed to some of the organic varieties that get planted. Nowadays, there is some more emphasis and expertise going towards that, but there is this lag, I would suppose. And then the other thing, I promised Greg I wouldn't call out Janet on this, but maybe Greg's just getting really good at managing these crops. That's a joke. Janet managed these crops in an expert fashion. And so I think what we see here is a combination of genetic potential and understanding how to improve and manage these situations.
There's also certainly a signal in this kind of potential output and increase in output in the percentage of corn that's in that rotation, simply because corn breeding has improved so rapidly, and the fact that corn is super productive and is very calorie dense. So,
But you also have synthetic amylase going into maize and soybeans.
yep, absolutely right.
Yep.
That's part of the arc of the story, but that's a great point. Yep.
So then we have our cool season pasture here, and you can see there's a pretty high amount of variation around all of the lines, all the trid lines, but maybe the most around the pasture. So that was maybe a little bit surprising for us that there was that much variation. That said, we are increasing our yields over time, and I guess also kind of surprising to us, but maybe not if we look at the literature. While it is sort of less productive overall than the other systems, the alfalfa and forage systems in particular, not that much less productive in terms of overall calories. And when we start to think about the input costs,